Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Sam Husseini joins us today. The origins of COVID-19 and the novel coronavirus are not yet clear, but the possibility of it being the result of bioweapons engineering, research, or gain-of-function experimentation that makes viruses more deadly, or some other scenario, have largely been dismissed from early on by officials and some scientists, and to a large extent suppressed by the corporate media. Regardless of the origin of this pandemic, there needs to be more discussion and airing of different views on the subject and on the topic of the global biological arms race that's very real and happening largely outside of the public view. There's an extra bonus segment for patrons on the question of privatized and/or covert biowarfare research. It's a short discussion with Sam and some additional information that I later added, reading from some articles and adding some commentary to expand a little and for important context. And you can find that extra episode on Patreon, episode 167 extra. Sam Husseini is a writer and an artist living in Maryland. He's been published in The Nation, Consortium News, CounterPunch, and elsewhere. He's a senior analyst for the Institute for Public Accuracy. He's also the founder of Vote Pact, which helps break out of the two-party bind. We recorded this on May 22nd, 2020. Sam Husseini's here, talking to us from the DC metro area. Hello, Sam. It's great to meet you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Good to be with you, Joanne.
Sam, since it's the first time you're on the show, if you would, just take a few minutes to tell us about yourself.
I am an independent journalist. I've worked with a number of progressive groups, most notably for years with the Institute for Public Accuracy. My journalism has focused on media, politics, foreign policy, especially weapons of mass destruction at times. I did a lot of, I think, important work around the lies leading up to the Iraq invasion, claims about Iraqi WMDs and so on. And critically, I did that, before the invasion. It became very fashionable for people who had been silent before the invasion to suddenly find that as a trendy thing to talk about after the invasion happened. And I occasionally go to news conferences. I got suspended from the National Press Club in 2011 for attempting to vigorously question a Saudi autocrat about the way that the Arab uprisings were formulating. I got dragged out of the Trump-Putin summit in 2018.
So that was you, huh?
That was me.
I remember that.
Trying to ask about the nuclear weapons ban treaty. A group won the Nobel Prize over it, and 122 countries backed it. U.S. and Russia are opposed to it, and nobody's asking about it. So I tried to change that. I occasionally go to the State Department as best I can. I tried to ask Elliot Abrams questions that they wouldn't take after they named him as a special envoy, I guess the term is, to Venezuela. So I've tried as best I can to use journalistic tools to try to actually, expose power and to talk about critical issues.
And then
my writings are at my personal webpage, Husseini.org, HUSSEINI.org.
Now, this topic, you've done a huge amount of research on it, and including some shoe leather research. You went to a CDC presser, right, at the press club back in February.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
And this was, I suspect, your first clue as to how publicly the science community, or a large part of it, the officials, the health officials, were going to deal with this. In other words, they were going to basically mock any questioning about the origins, and they were going to divert, this way it looks to me, they're going to try to early and often divert anyone's thoughts that this could possibly be a bioweapon, even though we have a large and growing biowarfare program here in this country. We might be the leaders, I don't know, but certainly across the world, there are other countries doing it too. And then we are outsourcing, providing grants and money for labs in other countries as well. And yet we are apparently not allowed to question whether something went wrong. Is that fair, a fair assessment of what you were
That
getting at?
that's generally a fair assessment. Very well put. Generally, the two clarifications I would make is that I had a bit of a clue going into this because I've certainly not specialized in this. As I said, I worked on Iraqi WMDs and I worked on some nuclear issues. I covered the Plowshares trial last year, for example, where activists, entered a major Trident nuclear facility. So I had some sense of how, these issues are dealt with, including by some of the scientific community, but not as starkly as I've seen the last several months while looking into this. I had something of a clue about it as well because of Francis Boyle's work. He wrote the relevant law implementing the Bioweapons Convention. And he's been a critic of these establishment, much of the scientific establishment on these issues. It's not an issue that I had looked at vigorously, but I was aware of his and a few other people's objections to this. Yes.
Yeah, and so Boyle and ironically Tom Cotton, two very different kinds of people,
Mm-hmm.
were two of the first to raise the alarm that this might be a bioweapon. Now, Boyle, as you mentioned, had written a law about biowarfare. Cotton, on the other hand, is, I don't know, if not the biggest hawk
Mm-hmm.
in the U.S. Senate, certainly, in the top two or top three.
Absolutely.
And so their goals, or their, um, in Cotton's case, agenda seem to be very different. And I think something we're going to talk about later in our interview is sort of the left, the anti-imperialist, the anti-war, or the anti-interventionist factions on the left and across the spectrum probably seem to have reacted to the Tom Cotton type response to all of this as using it opportunistically to gin up a war with China, a war of some kind. And I'll also talk about that a little bit later. And there may be some reactionary sort of reporting going on. They're trying to, understandably, because, we've been dealing with people, war profiteers, the national security state, the entire war machine, who is constantly trying to create enemies, create reasons for war, for profit and power and dominance. So, there are a lot of us who push back against that because the media is basically delinquent in their job of doing that. So I can understand why some people are approaching it that way, but it's also troublesome and it has bothered me. And your thoughts and analysis on this were very clarifying for me. They helped me understand what was really bugging me about that, because I certainly have read even some of my own friends saying, hey guys, yeah, I don't want a war with China either, but let's not make this too simplistic, or let's maybe just think about it a little bit more broadly. And I was glad that you brought that up, and we're going to talk about that later on for people who are listening, just get an idea. But first, there are two particular articles that Sam has written they were exactly what I was looking for. I have to thank you for doing this work, because
Thank
this
you.
is not my lane. Not only is it not my lane, I hate reading health, biology. I love science. I've been in science my whole life, but biology's never been my thing. I do like chemistry, but I have an aversion to it. So I really appreciated you pulling out the relevant studies, boiling it down, and citing different people to read. That was really important, I thought. And just the way that you framed it. First of all, you pushed back in your article in Salon in April. You titled, and all these will be links will be in the show notes. Titled, Contrary to Claims the Pandemic May Have Come from a Lab, and regardless, it exposes the threat of biowarfare arms race. And this is something I've said to my friends. I'm like, yeah, this really does bother me. I want to know if it was a biowarfare, if it was a bioweapon. But regardless, why are we doing that? Why do we even have these? And it's, you know what? I found out it's even worse. It's not just, bioweapons labs. There's something called a dual purpose where it is framed as biodefense, and there's something called gain of function research that's been going on, and it's been extremely controversial, reckless, and dangerous in some people's view. And from what I know, it seems just crazy to me. And then we've had some
arguably illegal. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Going all the way back to the Nuremberg trials, but also existing settled law.
This is true.
Yeah. So that's sort of the big picture of what we're going to talk about. And let's just first talk about your Salon article. I know you've talked about this a lot. You've done some other interviews, and let me also point out, also this will be in the show notes, but for people who want even more information on this, you want to hear more of what Sam has found and what he thinks. And I think you are going to want to, because this is not only just such an important topic, it's the way he has laid it out. It's the way he's able to explain it in layman's terms. And also the people who did this particular interview I'm going to cite are professional documentarians, and they did a fantastic job. So you should watch this and watch it soon, because this particular documentarian, their stuff's being pulled from YouTube. Big surprise. Hopefully they've got it somewhere else. And it's titled Perspectives on the Pandemic, Investigative Journalist Sam Husseini, Episode 7, and it's by Journeyman Films. There are other good interviews out there too, but I would say, from what I've seen, don't miss this one. So let's talk about your article, your Salon article, Sam, and tell us about what the reactions were to it and all that if you want to.
Well,
I know there's a ton in here. Yeah, so maybe I should boil this. Well, I'll just let you. I don't expect you to explain every single thing that's in it, but if you want to sort of summarize it, that'd be great.
I go through both the political and the media and the scientific failures as an overview, and perhaps the word failure is a euphemism, because in some cases bad results are a success to some people. Briefly, as you say, Tom Cotton, and the breakdown politically is very dangerous and nefarious. You have the sort of liberal establishment basically saying all of these labs are okay, and you have the Tom Cottons of the world saying just the Chinese labs are secretive and dangerous. And both of those things are wrong. All of these labs, and the US has spearheaded this effort to, dramatically escalate so-called biodefense. Biodefense and biowarfare are in significant part indistinguishable, because they just simply hinge on the stated motive of the state actor. So the US government can say, we're going to back research that's biodefense that will create more dangerous pathogens so that we can figure out how to defend against them. And that's called biodefense. Now, that fundamentally violates the treaty. The treaty doesn't even have an exemption for defensive work. It says it allows peaceful work, which I think that there is a significant difference between the two of those things. but so that's one layer of failure. The other layer of failure is, as I dug back in this, the scientific community has been deluged by all of this money, and this money came in, ironically. Your listeners might remember, after the 9/11 attacks, there were also the anthrax attacks. Um, uh, Anthrax was sent by mail to members of Congress, to members of the media. Everybody was terrified of opening their mail. There was widespread public panic, not dissimilar from the dynamics that we see today. And it was during this period that the Bush administration, Bush-Cheney administration, was able to ram through the Patriot Act. Congress was actually suspended for a bit. The Afghanistan war basically started during this period, and the case for a full-scale invasion of Iraq was started.
Can I interject something here?
Absolutely.
Just to reinforce what you said about how scared people were. I'm in New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia. A lot of these letters with anthrax originated here in New Jersey, and also the regional post office where all of my mail goes through. It's the Belmar Regional Post Office. Was shut down and tested because they found the anthrax on the machines. So yeah, we were really scared. I had little kids and all that. And I just also want to mention that recently Robbie Martin did an interview with Whitney Webb, and they sort of combined their research that Robbie has done on the anthrax attacks and Whitney is doing now, Amerithrax, or the parallels that she sees. I'm not going to do her justice if I try to summarize what she's, because it's very broad spanning, and I'm going to talk to her on Monday.
Right.
Yeah. So if you want more on this, that's where you should go, because the Patriot Act was hitting some bumps in the road. There were some Democratic senators who were resisting it, and some of them became targets, right, Sam?
Correct.
Well,
Leahy was a target. He had been indicating that he was resisting it. And Meryl Nass has also done magnificent work on this and other bioweapons stuff. She has her anthrax vaccine blog. And so they start using this to point fingers at Iraq. Opinion pieces in the New York Times, other outlets. Andrew Sullivan, esteemed pundit extraordinaire, actually called for considering nuking Iraq at this point.
Oh my
God. That's the way that went. The FBI tried to pin it on a series of so-called lone wolves. That one person could have done all of this, eventually pinning it on Bruce Ivins, a scientist at Fort Detrick, their main bioweapons, biodefense facility in Maryland, and he commits suicide. So there's no trial. Mueller was head of the FBI at this point. He comes before Leahy's, I guess, Judiciary Committee in 2008, and Leahy says, "I'm not buying this." So even the target effectively accuses the FBI of a cover-up. And again, Meryl Nass has done probably the most extensive work on this. And of course, Mueller would go on to basically determine the agenda of the Democratic Party over the last 3 years in terms of Russiagate and so on. So, it's remarkable to me that other than myself and Whitney Webb and her circles, virtually no one is talking about the anthrax attacks.
Yeah, and I mean, just a disclaimer here, neither of us are denying that this is a virus, that this is a pandemic, that this is a danger, that we need to
absolutely
guard against it. We're not virus deniers. There are some people who, as soon as they question anything, they turn their rhetorical guns at you and start calling you a virus denier. That's not the case here. We're not saying this was a bioweapon. We are just citing the history that we know and that we, continue to find out about here. And we're just analyzing this as rational people.
Right.
Is that fair, Sam?
Absolutely. There are three basic, possibilities here. One, it had nothing to do with any lab, which I sort of hesitate to say came from nature, because then the question becomes, is it accelerated because of factory farming and deforestation and so on? Um, that's one possibility. Another possibility that it was an accidental release from one of two um, bio labs in Wuhan. Wuhan, where the outbreak apparently started, is the only declared BSL-4 lab in all of China. BSL-4 labs deal with the most deadly pathogens. They presumably have the most stringent safety requirements in terms of suits and airflow and so on, but they deal with extremely dangerous pathogens. Um, and the third possibility is that those labs are effectively being framed. That is, some entity or agency or tentacle of some government basically released it in Wuhan in order to frame the labs, in order to put the Chinese government on the defensive regarding their bioweapons capacities, while not scrutinizing the bioweapons capacities, which are far more extensive, of the United States and its various allies. Those are the
Well,
sort of the three, to me, realistic possibilities.
I would add something I've been thinking about later, sort of an extension to your last one there, as to one being framed. I think the framing could go either way. I think that it's possible that this is a hybrid war, that there's more than one actor
Correct.
here, that it's not necessarily a nation state actor too,
Correct. That's true.
because there's been a major increase discussions and warnings about hybrid war in recent years. And some 70% of Americans that we know of, including military veterans, are fed up with the wars. 70% of military veterans and this roughly the same percent of the public said that the Iraq and the Afghanistan war, not only were they against them, they said they were not even worth fighting. We also have an elite class and a national security state that is terrified of populist uprisings across the political spectrum, too. It's not just on the left or on the right. We have an empire in serious decline. Everybody knows it. They even talk about, they use the word empire now, they never used to. They talk about it being in decline, which was not allowed to be admitted in the past. We've seen persistent efforts, the use of force and other hybrid sort of techniques to maintain dominance, to coerce other countries. Um, and I'm talking about ubiquitous, so lots of them. How would we even know if this was a war? An exponential increase in secrecy, in covert actions, in privatized intelligence, and in mercenaries who carry out these covert actions, in the use of proxies. Um, could they wage whole wars in secrecy now, or scale up the covert actions, let's say, to almost to the level of an entire war? So I think that a lot of the war profiteers have realized that invasions won't work anymore and still want to make, they still want to profit from this. So in some ways, I think maybe we're thinking too small. Again, I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm just saying that based on the now years of study from the foreign policy, geopolitics, and the war, and the interventionist things that I have seen, that I've talked to people about, I think that has to be considered as a possibility, especially the part that it may not be a nation state versus nation state thing. I think we have factional wars going on. I can't explain them. I don't know how they line up. But something different has been going on, especially since 2016. Anyway, I just want to interject that.
Yeah, I think that there's some truth to that, and I think it is probably accelerating. But there's always been, some dynamics in terms of, countries, governments aren't monoliths, and different factions want different things.
And
Um,
there is a faction who have for a long time now believed in a nuclear first strike, which is just most military people you talk to, I think they say that's just crazy. No one can win a nuclear war. Lawrence Wilkerson would say that he has sat in on numerous war games, war with China. It always ends in nuclear war. We can't win a land war there. They can't win a naval war. It goes to nukes. So, and there are people who are extremists who used to be considered crazies, but, and people like Wilkerson will tell you that, and Wes Clark will say that during the 9/11, during the Bush Cheney administration, they hijacked foreign policy and they somehow came into more power and they've maintained power. And their mindset is such that, a first strike using an extreme weapon is acceptable and necessary. So, I mean, hopefully they are kept down, but with this administration, he doesn't seem to have much control of the people around him. And,
Well,
that's just,
yeah, it's a weird dynamic with Trump where he poses as a quasi isolationist one day and then a hyper militarist the next, and you know it's not clear to me to what extent, and I think a lot of people pretend that it's clear to them, and it's not at all, to what extent he's sort of, manipulating his isolationist base to further goals of empire, or to what extent, longtime apparatchiks like, Bill Barr and others are in effect shielding Trump so long as he furthers the agenda that they want, and that they
right.
will turn on him and flush him down the toilet if he were to actually act on those isolationist, on that isolationist rhetoric.
Right, right. So anyway, I took us a little bit off track. I apologize for that. But on the
It's,
possibilities, I like the way you laid out the potential scenarios. And the question is why, well, some of those possibilities there was an early effort to sort of squash those. And some really prominent scientists and magazines and institutions seem to be, you know, part of that,
yeah,
coming out right off the bat and saying, no, this was not a lab engineered
right.
organism.
Right. When I questioned the CDC about it on February 11th, she said it's of natural origin. When I asked, about gain of function work, and so on, and about the proximity of the labs, the bats that these originally came from are 1,000 miles away. They're caves. And she said, you got to be careful about rumors, basically. And then when I said, well, my second question was, what about, couldn't they have collected the bats and then stored them at this facility, and then the leak happened from there? Just because you can prove that it was of natural origin doesn't mean that. And she said, she put out her line about rumors, which just shut down the discussion. And I thought that was very curious. And then that same line was echoed in this letter in the Lancet, very prestigious magazine, signed by a number of scientists who I'm learning more about, and some of them have a very peculiar, interesting background we can get into, which purported to be a letter of solidarity to the workers of Wuhan, but had this phrase of warning against quote unquote conspiracy theories as to the non-natural origin of the pandemic. And then shortly after that, a Nature Medicine article appeared, which purported to show that it was not a laboratory construct. Both of these letters in these ostensibly prestigious magazines were highly problematic, as were other things that the scientific community did. And we can get into that too. I haven't written yet about this. I expect to. The Lancet letter, the first signer of it is Kalischer. You do a little research on him, He has been accused by the Cuban government of spreading biowarfare in Cuba. The last author of the Nature Medicine article is a very strange character by the name of Robert Gary at Tulane. And he keeps popping up at remarkably politically convenient times. So and he's a much longer, more complicated story, but and also in the Lancet letter was signed by Peter Dasnik. He is head of the Eco Health Alliance, very earthy, crunchy sounding thing, which has on its board, a scientific advisory board, longtime member of the of Fort Detrick, the main U.S. bio quote unquote defense facility. He gets money from Colgate Palmolive. He gets money from Johnson and Johnson. He gets tons of money from the U.S. government until recently when they cut him off, and now he has used his extremely extensive connectedness to, to protest against that. His work of collecting these bats has been called by Richard E. Bright, the Rutgers University, the leading scientific critic of this gain-of-function work of collecting stuff from bat caves as Indiana Jones adventurism and the definition of insanity. What they're trying to do, what they're pretending to try to do is the following. They're saying there might be these deadly pathogens out there. And in part, they might acknowledge that it might be accelerated by human activity, like factory farming, like deforestation. But instead of saying, okay, maybe we need to scale back those activities, they say, okay, well, let's do another activity, short circuit the whole thing. Let's go out there, find these deadly viruses, create new deadlier viruses, make deadly flus that aren't airborne. Let's make them airborne, ostensibly for the purpose of trying to defend against them. Again, this would seem to violate the bioweapons convention. So that they have all of this money doing all of this, and now, as we see, that they are not defending us, right? They've succeeded in collecting and creating these deadly pathogens, but here we are, no defense, and people living in fear. So, one wonders if the stated goals of biodefense are the actual goals. So and in the Nature Medicine article, what I go into somewhat in the Salon article, and what has become more apparent over time, is that it's very problematic. They say it's not a laboratory construct. That doesn't disprove that it didn't come out of, that it wasn't naturally occurring and came out of a lab. And that was obvious. That was obvious to me from the beginning.
This is some of the most important information in your article, in my view.
Yeah, thank you. The other possibilities are that there are other ways other than direct genetic manipulation, which they purport to prove didn't happen, and I'm not even 100% sure about that, but let's accept the claim that it's not genetically engineered. There are other ways besides genetically engineering to do this. And the first person who pointed this out to me was Dr. Meryl Nass, a very independent-minded doctor who followed the anthrax, several anthrax cases, actually. She was the first person, to my knowledge, to document biowarfare being used against black farmers in Zimbabwe, for example. And she said you can use radiation. You can, there are a whole assortment of ways you can do this. Richard E. Bright more than confirmed this and said, yeah, you can do animal passages. And this was a reference to what was done in 2011, and that did cause substantial concern at the time. In 2011, scientists in Holland, as well as the University of Wisconsin, succeeded in making the avian flu more easily transmissible in people. They didn't use bioengineering to do this. They used animal passages. They passed the avian flu through ferrets, which have a respiratory system that seems quite similar to human respiratory system. And after they passed it through a number of ferrets, they quote unquote succeeded in the quote unquote scientific discovery of making a deadly pathogen more easily transmissible. This did cause serious concern at the time. The New York Times in 2012 actually had an editorial entitled "An Engineered Doomsday," and the main concern there was they shouldn't publish these results because they're afraid of the terrorists getting them. And again, that's a very narrow view of who the terrorists are. So let's recall the anthrax attacks. The terrorists were the evil Al-Qaeda Iraqis when the threat was coming from within the United States government, within the bowels of the U.S.'s own biowarfare capacity or allies. We don't know who they shared those spores with. Spores were destroyed, apparently, making it extremely difficult to actually pin down who ultimately was responsible for those anthrax attacks that came at such a politically convenient time. So that Nature Medicine article is at best extremely disingenuous in that it purports to show that it didn't come out of a lab when all it actually seems to show is that it wasn't bioengineered. Different things, totally different things. So, and you see, it's most unfortunate, people who really should know better just simply echoing this. So this claim, that it was dismissed that it came out of a lab initially, and then, any time that you raise the issue, people will ultimately reference that Nature Medicine article, including people on the left. This thing got through USA Today and the Washington Post and ABC and blah blah blah. All these major outlets just simply echoed because they have to bow down, the secular priesthood of quote unquote scientist at a university. Therefore, it must be true. Not understanding that science has debates, that scientists, just like economists, just like journalists, have interests, have financial interests, have ties to government, and so on. And so you see a whole assortment of people who, from my point of view, should way more than know better. I mean, Peter Daszak was uncritically brought on to Democracy Now! I've seen the Nature Medicine article referenced as, holy script by Gray Zone Project, by all kinds of outlets that typically, try to, scrutinize things.
Yeah, and they generally do. They are very. They do apply scrutiny in most cases. In fact, they are working on the OPCW story where and that was a false flag type situation that was sort of laundered through the OPCW. There were whistleblowers, and so I know they're very well aware, but unwittingly might be enforcing the sort of the acceptable narrative here by citing those things. Yeah, I'm surprised by it too, but I think there are a lot of sort of innocent reasons for it too, but right. I think they should be asked about that because they have shown such scrutiny and they do know the history, and we're not just talking about the Gray Zone. There are others too, but a lot of people are going to follow their lead as well because none of us are experts, or hardly any of us are experts on this. We're also, this is a crisis, and people don't think as rationally during crises, which is why they're exploited, right? So,
absolutely, I think that there are people who are somewhat experts, and it's been remarkable to me how much they haven't been referenced by independent media. I mean, I went to them. In addition to the ones that I've mentioned, there's also Stuart Newman and Jonathan Latham. There are independent-minded progressive scientists who have dealt with these issues and have tried to grapple in this case. And it's been remarkable how little pickup there has been of their views and assessments in media generally, and especially among progressive journalists. And I severely hope that that'll change very quickly.
That's one of the questions I was going to ask you for some names of people who should be, who've, been underutilized as sources and, whose work we should read. Ebright is one of them. I'm a Rutgers alum, so I'm going to try to reach out to him. I didn't know anything about gain of function research. Scary as all heck. But yeah, I'm going to try to talk with him. And then I've heard RFK talking about the gain of function. He's amplified that message a bit. And then there's Judy Mikovits, which, to be honest, I'm not sure what to. I don't know how to assess her work and the things that she has said, but RFK has boosted her work and her book and things. So I'm going strictly on intuition and my experience that I'm not 100% on board with her. But RFK, I would think, I don't have any reason not to trust him. Do you have any thoughts on those?
I really don't. I've stuck with my sources who I don't necessarily agree with 100%, but I think are highly credible and I don't necessarily agree, among themselves. As I've mentioned, Francis Boyle. Now, Francis Boyle was early on in saying that it is bioengineered, and he was widely dismissed because of that. What's notable is that Martinier, the French Nobel Prize winner in medicine, who discovered HIV, has been saying something similar recently. So that he has not published a finding establishing that. Other scientists, Nicola Petrovsky in Australia, has done a computer simulation that seems to indicate that it was created in a laboratory. And as I say, Meryl Nass is a unique figure in my mind because she understands the science. She's a physician, not a scientist, but she understands the science certainly far more than a lay person like myself on this issue. And she has been through it with these other things with the anthrax attacks and so on. So she has a sense of the political dynamics as well. And she has her own political, left history. So she's been a tremendous resource who I'd highly recommend on this issue.
Yeah, I might reach out to you to try to get an interview with her if she's willing to do that kind of thing. Boyle, I saw an interview with him early on, right, and I haven't seen anything of him since. Now, right from the start here, sorry, please go.
I'm sorry. Some of his interviews have been purged, so from YouTube and so on. So I'm sure that he's done more interviews than are out there. But yes,
I mean, even if he's dead wrong, can't we listen to it? Can we listen to his argument?
Yeah, that to me is the part of the huge media failure is take the obvious flagship Democracy Now. They didn't even tell their listeners that the possibility that it came out of a lab in Wuhan until they had Peter Daszak on, who's an involved party with clear conflicts of interest, to purportedly debunk it.
And they don't mention the conflict of interest, I guess, right?
They do, but in a complimentary way. They say, you work with these people, so you would know, right? So it's sort of a weird way of acknowledging the conflict of interest. They didn't mention the labs until, I think, early April, when they said that the labs in Wuhan were the ones who discovered the coronavirus, so that it becomes merely a credit to them, not that they could conceivably have been the source of the outbreak. But the other failure is that this tendency to just simply invite people who you agree on, who you agree with, rather than, say, okay, well, maybe I agree with you on this, but I'm going to challenge you on this, that, and the other thing. Fine, Democracy Now! Might not agree with Francis Boyle or with Meryl Nass or with Jonathan Latham, or with Stuart Newman or with myself or whoever. Can't you, bring on two people and have a debate? You just got to, bring on somebody with a clear conflict of interest to purportedly shoot down, quote unquote, Trump's theory, because they only covered it after Fox News questioned Trump about it, and Trump sort of, floats the idea that it came out of a lab. So suddenly it's Trump's theory. So of course, any right-minded person will, of course, dismiss it. And here we have this, scientist with he had a picture of the Buddha over his shoulder on the wall there. So he's a good, earthy, crunchy guy without saying, "Oh, hold on, you get money from Colgate-Palmolive. You've gotten all this money from this. Hold on, you funneled money that did gain of function work that had to get an exemption from the NIH when they were putting a stop to this kind of funding because it was dangerous. There was a stop to this quote unquote gain of function work from 2014 to 2017. No challenges, no challenge. And then he gets puffy treatment on 60 Minutes. It's just, he's got a very well-funded, well-oiled media machine. And again, it was sort of his shtick to allegedly protect against this very outcome. I don't know that it came out of a lab, and I don't know that he's the culprit here. But at minimum, he should be getting a ton more scrutiny than he's getting.
Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, I would have been surprised by something like that by Democracy Now!, which used to be a go-to place for me. But
Mm-hmm.
I unfortunately watched their coverage of Syria
Mm-hmm.
and then Russiagate, and I lost all faith in them. I don't know what happened. I know there's a lot of fear. I know there's funding issues. I know there are, in the case of independent media, right from the start with this pandemic, they made it clear that they're going to knock people off of social media. So you spend all this time building an audience, and followers and subscribers and all this stuff, and then you could just be knocked out one day.
Yeah,
And some
that
people
is a
just
real
don't want to take the chance.
right.
So,
Right.
but I think you should at least disclaim that you are doing that. They
Yeah.
can't censor you for saying, look, there are things I want to say, but I can't say
Right.
because of my fear of censorship and losing all the foundation that I've built. You know.
Right. I totally agree with you. And let me go ahead and do that. And let me say, Zero Hedge got kicked off of Twitter after they did some work, some of which might have been wrong or dubious on this issue. But I think that certainly affected me. I questioned them on February 11th. My article didn't get published in Salon until April 24th, I think. Part of the I should double check that. Part of the problem with that was a lot of quote unquote lefty sites wouldn't
Pick you up.
were
Yeah.
skittish. But I wasn't tweeting away because of the terseness of Twitter. I thought that I could be easily misunderstood. And therefore get totally bounced off of Twitter. And then I'd have no avenue, no recourse at all. So I was trying very hard to get a full-fledged, thoughtful article out. And eventually Salon picked it up, thank God. Although that was part of the problem. They only called me after Trump got asked about it. I'd been, knocking on their door. So, that slowed down what I was able to get out because of those dynamics, because of the reluctance of some of the left, which started early on. It has accelerated because Trump has has referenced this issue, but it was clearly there from the get-go.
Right. And of course, the way you combated that seems to me is your article in Salon is heavily, linked and referenced. It's researched. It's got huge numbers of links in it and sites of specific people, which I was very glad to see because then that gives me a pat. I could pull on that thread, rather than people who just make these broad statements.
Yeah, I very
Um,
much wanted that to be a resource for other people to build off of this because there is such a huge body of work and research to do here. Um, in part because if I can reference another aspect of this, the relevant institutions have collapsed. There was
yes.
a group, the Council for Responsible Genetics, very important group, had a lot of scientists. Meryl Nass was involved in it, so were a lot of other really good people. And they couldn't get funding, and they actually worked with Francis Boyle to get the implementation of the Biowarfare Convention implemented in 1989, finally. But they went under, and I believe another similar group, I believe it was called the Sunlight Foundation. I wasn't familiar with it until I did this work, and Andrew Coburn mentioned it to me, and I haven't had time to investigate them. I'm sure that there is a ton of useful information, via Wayback Machine on those respective web pages that I haven't had time to, go back and look through. So that this entire field of science has been corrupted. In 2005, after they started funding all of this money to so-called biodefense, 700 scientists signed a petition saying, hold on, you're totally perverting our field here with all of this weapons-oriented stuff, to the NIH about their funding priorities. And it was Fauci, the revered Fauci, who responded. And he basically told these scientists in a piece in the New York Times, the American people, through their elected representatives, he's talking about the Bush-Cheney administration here, have told us what their priorities are. And, this work is going to happen, and it can happen through other agencies, by which he probably means the Pentagon or the CIA, or it can happen through us. Or at least we should have a seat at the table. So basically telling the scientific community to put up or shut up, that this was the direction that things were going to go in. So you kind of have Fauci, and he's being played as the anti-Trump. It's sort of a reincarnation of the Mueller-Trump
Yeah.
dynamic, where
This vaunted figure. Yeah.
exactly a figure that is the virtual embodiment of the establishment suddenly becomes a great hero of enlightened thought because he's allegedly critical of Trump. Meanwhile, his agenda is one that can be extremely detrimental to the public, to the cause of peace, and ultimately to science.
Yeah, and I mean they even throw some marketing in there. You see references to the Avengers and things like this. We have a world right now, certainly our world here in the States, where the institutions have lost so much trust. The media has lost trust. Politicians have lost trust. And they use celebrities for a long time, to as proxies because they lost their own trust, so they throw someone else out there. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very clear that at this point it's the scientists trust the science and all this stuff. But I have to say that I have a science background. I used to put scientists, engineers, even IT and tech people on a pedestal because through experience, and I've even said this to friends of mine, that IT people were some of the most honest people I ever worked with. And 20 years ago, I said, and if they weren't, this world would be complete chaos because it's not that hard to do, to meddle with some things and just set things, you know, to go haywire. And I have since then, there have been a number of things that have, the whole cybersecurity world has reduced my faith in my own field, but also a couple of things. And one of them was this OPCW situation. It's clear that that organization is corrupted. The Another organization who I really trusted was the Doctors Without Borders, and I still have some trust in them, but some of their they didn't actually have people on the ground in Syria, but they had people they funded and I guess trusted, who then sort of helped with some of these chemical weapons attacks, planted stories that were used to justify attacks. But the thing that really started me wondering what was going on was actually the Gulf of Mexico oil blowout, if you remember that situation. I remember that people couldn't seem to figure out how much oil was blowing out of that thing into the Gulf. And it was very muddled for a long time. And I was shocked that there weren't more scientists from the region talking about it, assisting and giving information. And I heard or I read that the corporations had basically bought up a lot of them. They basically, and there's a whole grant process. There's a very complicated process in academia and in research right now. You know, a lot of um, universities, including state universities like the one I went to, they're research institutions now, and it's changed the dynamic considerably. And some of them have decided that for their own survival, they should keep their mouth shut.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that.
There's definitely a lot of that. This myth of, in this case, and you know, there's a ton of, you know, since 9/11, since the anthrax attacks, is at least $5 billion a year into so-called biodefense. And the media mantra now that there's a scientific consensus is totally wrong. There is a very vocal set of well-connected scientists, including this group EcoHealth Alliance and, you know, a few other circles that are sort of similar and have connections to government and corporations and so on. And you know, a few very lonely individuals that you know are basically the people that I talk to, you know, really scrutinizing it. And but there's a mass of utter silence from the scientific community, and to what extent that is because of funding pressures, because they don't want to buck the trend, because they're intimidated by this very obviously well coordinated effort of, you know, the Lancet, the letter that appeared in the Lancet and the article that appeared in Nature Medicine, or whatever, that they have chosen very clearly to remain. I've reached out to these people. At least one of them was asked a question. Mark Lipsitch, I think is how you pronounce his last name, at Harvard, who has been a critic of this gain of function work. He actually, in his writing, doesn't call it gain of function work. He very properly calls it potentially pandemic pathogens, PPPs.
Mm.
But he was asked at a news conference, this is on my Twitter timeline, at a news conference recently about, you know, what would a inquiry about the origins of this look like, and you know, should we be scrutinizing the lab work that's done here and so on? And he basically just said, I'm not going to take that. You know, I'm just not going to answer that question. It was just remarkable. You know, that, you know, we got to deal with other things now. We can't deal with this, and I gotta play nice with the people who are on the opposite side of that issue. Which, you know, I mean, maybe I could understand the rationalization for that until the Lancet letter and the Nature Medicine article came out, because basically, you know, he's, you know, privileged enough to be at a very prestigious university, Harvard, and he has a co-author at Yale. Anyway, so
Yeah,
then,
that name is in here.
yeah,
Let me just real quick. I can find it for you.
I'll,
Alison Galvani.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Now she's been out there on other things in terms of, you know, whether or not the lockdown should continue and so on. I've even dealt with her on that, but she's been totally silent on, and he has, about the questions about gain of function, about the origin of this, about the dangers of these labs. You know, I mean, people are right to be angry about what is going on.
Right.
So is anger going to manifest itself in terms of bigotry, or in terms of taking it out on other people, or it can be very nefarious. Or is it going to be, hold on, these labs are dangerous regardless of the cause of this pandemic. These things are a very serious threat to the future health of, I mean, even outlets that are doing decent work now, barely decent work, like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, by and large, are not referencing their prior work on this. They had an article last year saying, how likely it is that one of these labs will be the cause of a pandemic.
That's very strange.
It's incredible. There is this body of work. It hasn't been, as rigorous as it should have been, but it's definitely there. And it's not being referenced back. And furthermore, all of these articles, there was a Nature article, I believe from 2017, about the lab in Wuhan, and how, hold on, maybe this is dangerous here. And they put on it in February a little notice saying some people on social media are referencing this, and there's no evidence that it came out of this lab. So basically undermining their own reporting, contemporaneous reporting at the time. And so, that opened the door for these right-wing hawks in the Washington Post to reference these State Department cables as being the warning of this. Well, you don't need to look at the State Department cables. It was in Nature magazine, reported in real time, that, hold on, maybe we shouldn't be, having more and more of these types of labs in more and more countries. And again, that's not at all to say that just Chinese labs are the problem. The problem is the United States. The United States has by far the most labs. The United States is funding by far the most dangerous work, from the information that I've been able to determine. And most critically, the United States government, through several administrations, has driven this biological weapons arms race. The Obama administration in 2008 hindered attempts at the United Nations to, really deal with this issue. And that's been, from what I've been able to find, and it's hard to find specifics in some cases, but from what I've been able to find, a recurring pattern. Basically, what was considered a triumph, that you could put a genie back in the bottle of biological weapons and chemical weapons, is showing that it's not the case, that the interests of empire, of militarism, and so on have transcended that, and it's being manifested now in a different way.
So, Sam, first of all, I urge people to read these articles and follow some different threads that are in them, because there are a lot of good ones, and it would take us 5 episodes to go through everything that is in here, but very readable. I don't want to discourage you. They're dense articles, but they're very, very easy to read. Let's end with something we started to talk about. What kind of work can someone like me can the I don't consider myself a journalist. Can the journalist who we respect, who we are in the same circle with, the people who do try to get better information out there and try to dig into things, what do you think is the best path forward? You had indicated to me that you think that more debates, discussions, challenging people, in civil ways, of course, is something that is needed. Try to lay out, if you would, what you would like to see going forward, what you think would be beneficial for all of us.
Yeah, I think that we unfortunately have this system of basically sectarianism, where people kind of just, talk with people they agree with. I think that we need to try to break out of that. I mean, some safe spaces are needed, but you need to have meaningful debates with people, and Democracy Now!, Pacifica, other independent outlets, say The Intercept, other things need to be interviewing people they don't agree with and asking tough questions and letting the chips fall where they may. Um, I think, I don't know, you telling me you're not a journalist, you're asking pertinent questions here. um, you know, so I think that, maybe I'm wrong to be looking to these institutions for the answers, and maybe we need new institutions. And we, can be more skilled in using, the internet to share information and so on. It's difficult because the corporate tech giants, euphemistically called social media, are playing interference for their interests and for government interests, or purging and shadow banning content, including some of the content that I've been involved in creating. So there are real obstacles. I think that if there's an independent journalist who's looking at this, let's look at the funding of the most prominent scientists trying to dismiss scrutiny of this dangerous lab work, for example. I indicated earlier the Council for Responsible Genetics and other groups that have scrutinized this and have gone under. Their stuff is still available on the web through a Wayback Machine. That needs to be seriously looked at. There were warnings there. We need to scrutinize science as we would any other profession. The economic profession basically has been complicit on a whole series of corruptions, including the 2008 collapse and so on. And there's no reason that science isn't similarly inclined. There have been pleas, the Einstein-Russell Manifesto and others, for scientists to live up to their ethical obligations in terms of the work that they do and don't do. They were thinking about scientists in nuclear work, and that still totally applies, but it applies to the so-called life sciences just as much, at least. I think people who scrutinize these government institutions need to be held up a great deal. Last year, I covered the Plowshares actions, where they went into the Trident facility, and it was remarkable to me. I wrote about it for The Nation. Got some coverage, but the coverage didn't really get at the critical issues as to how dangerous these facilities are, how repressive the legal structure is. I covered the trial, and they wouldn't even let them talk about how dangerous nuclear weapons are, or bring in any experts, Daniel Ellsberg and so on. The judge prohibited all of that. So you saw this sort of authoritarianism without authority, and I think we see that same tendency elsewhere, where the powers that be get to choose the experts and get to talk about what they regard as quote unquote evidence, and to silence or marginalize experts that might, really, really scrutinize where things are going and what the, hidden vested interests are. I think that there's a, tendency to view things nationalistically, and through very sectarian things. You got Fox demonizing the Democrats, and you got MSNBC demonizing the Republicans. You got, Al Jazeera putting out the line from Qatar, and, RT, putting out a pro-Russian line, and CGTV now putting out a Chinese line. I was recently on CGTV because they wanted to talk about how dangerous U.S. labs were.
Yeah, they'll let you talk if you
Right.
you can get a dissident view on there. But I mean, if that's
Right.
the only place you can go, you go. So
Right. Yeah, it's hard not to go because you're not getting a hearing anywhere else. But it's not right. I mean, there isn't a real town square
right.
where you can have these kinds of discussions and debates, and where you can scrutinize all parties. And I mean, let's do a thought experiment. Pompeo says that they have evidence against that it was the labs in Wuhan, and then he seemed to back away from it. Let's say that that's true. Do you think that Pompeo and Trump would just simply release that evidence, or wouldn't they try to use it as leverage? I mean,
Yeah, I heard you make this argument. Very interesting argument.
I
You
mean,
don't think they would publicize it. You think they'd use it to their benefit, use it as a weapon, basically, or as a leverage tool for bargaining. Yeah.
absolutely. If for no other reason. I mean, look, after the 9/11 attacks, Colin Powell said, "Oh, of course we're going to put out the evidence that Al Qaeda did it." They never did that. He backtracked. Now, I didn't presume from that that they didn't have the evidence. I think that either they were using it for leverage or they just simply don't want the precedent of evidence being the criteria because then they can't invade Iraq.
Yeah.
So evidence isn't something that's not, they don't want an open, honest, evidence-based discussion. That doesn't mean that they don't have it. So they could either be using it as leverage or they could be waiting till October, when it would be much more advantageous for them to spring the evidence at that point. We simply don't know and don't pretend to know just simply because Trump and Pompeo, and elements in the Washington Post say certain things and we know they're liars and they might even lie on this issue doesn't mean that the underlying claims are invalid. Just simply because Trump says the sky is blue doesn't mean that it's yellow, even if he then says that he's the guy who made it be blue. So there's a lot of fallacious thinking going on about when people are attempting to analyze these things, I believe. But
Yeah,
feel free to disagree with me.
yeah, well, actually I I can't on this one because the I'm guilty of bringing on people who I tend to agree with,
I
but
understand.
my
It's
agenda
hard
is
not to.
different. Hmm?
It's hard not to, but go ahead.
Well, my agenda is to try to amplify a point of view or information that I don't think is getting enough attention.
And
So, but maybe I should try to challenge some people or just listen to them, what their perspective is. There have certainly been some guests who I have not completely agreed with, but the thing is, though, there we know better, right? This whole trust us.
hmm
No, why should we ever trust you?
hmm
Well, here's the history, some of the things that we just laid out, and that some of our colleagues are choosing. And I guess you have to you have to choose certain people to trust if you're not an expert in that subject, especially, which is particularly difficult with this topic with cybersecurity for other people. But there were a lot of tells. The early propaganda was a tell. The
Correct.
shutting down
Correct.
of the conspiracy theory. We know that, okay? We've been railing against that,
Correct.
mocking that for 3 years because
Right.
it was so broadly used with Russiagate. And
Correct.
there are other tells in there too. The way things are framed, the gross bat soup and the wet markets that are just framed as, oh, look at these people, the disgusting things they eat, and oh yeah, oh how dumb they are that they would even do. They don't know how dangerous it is. I've seen people, just come right out and say that, maybe they should learn not to eat certain things, or they talk about how they, certain, parts of animals are used for um, archaic religious type things. They have a number of different ways of just making you snap your fingers and say, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, yeah."
Right.
Um, it's a framing that we have seen. We recognize this, and we should have our own defenses against that, against it not taking us off in a certain direction. Um, but yeah, maybe some forums too. Even and I have seen some roundtables, so I give them credit for that. But yeah, I do think that we need to, at the very least, we need to be questioning things. And I will definitely give that some thought as to, don't just interview people who you agree with. And I'm open to any other ideas, so-called debates. I'm not talking about the sensationalized ones. I'm
Exactly.
talking about just a civil discussion. You don't even have to call it a debate. But let's let's just talk this through. Let's present our points of view. I think we should go forward with that. I really do.
Yeah. I mean, again, as I indicated, some of my sources don't agree with each other, and I tried to lay that out in my piece. And if you or other people end up interviewing them, to question them about what the other sources and what other people. I mean, I'd love a debate between the Nature Medicine authors and some of the sources that I've used. Those kinds of things need to happen. I'd love a debate between people like Francis Boyle, who say that the U.S. is violating the Biological Weapons Convention, and people who claim that it's not. Those things are long, long overdue. So I think that there's a lot of ground to cover for a lot of good people.
Let's follow up on that. See if there's anything we can team up on and do with that. I'd appreciate that.
Thank you.
Do you know if I had heard that there biowarfare work being done in labs that are not associated with any nation state or multiple nation states working together? Are there any privatized? Is that legal? Would it be allowed? Because there's so much privatization. The question about privatized and or covert biowarfare research is an extra bonus segment for patrons. It's a short discussion with Sam, and I later added some additional information, reading from some articles and adding some commentary to expand a little and for important context. So you can find that at Patreon, episode 167 Extra. I'm not great at marketing, it's not my forte, but I'm starting to provide more bonus material for patrons, as is necessary for independent media funded solely by listeners, because I appreciate them, and they make it possible to pay the overhead costs of this show and compensate a little bit for the labor that goes into it. So that's my tease. I hope that some of you will subscribe to this podcast to get these kinds of extras, and they're also full patrons-only episodes, and soon a Discord channel, and hopefully some live streams for discussions among ourselves. So that's episode 167 Extra, available at Patreon. And now I'll just continue with the interview wrap-up. All right, well, I've kept you way over time, and I really appreciate this discussion and the work that you've done. Sincerely, thank you for these articles. They advanced me. and even though I'm kind of averse to the topic, they were really good, the way you formatted them, the perspective that you took, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk on this podcast, and it was great to meet you.
Great to meet you. Thank you, Joanne.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Sam Husseini. Follow Sam on Twitter at Sam Husseini. Find his work at husseini.org. The Around the Empire podcast, independent media. Your support's really important. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Lots of ways to find and listen to this podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit the thumbs up to like the individual videos and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.